In this section, we'll note very briefly that not everybody benefited from the economic boom in the 1920s. Organized labor and farmers didn't do that well. The fact that membership fell from 5 million people to 3.5 million people over the decade really shouldn't come as a surprise. The overall prosperity sort of mellowed people, and to an extent, the bitter end of World War I, the 1919 labor strikes, and all the violence that resulted were still on the minds of people, and people still sort of associated labor strikes with Bolshevism and violence and radicals, and so that kind of hurt labor organization. But moreover, we had discussed how employers were using welfare capitalism, and while that helped workers in a way because it provided a carrot as well as sticks, it provided things like pensions and that type of thing. It also meant that labor membership was decreasing. And undoubtedly, the use of welfare capitalism was in part intended to be against organized labor. The conservative Republicans were in power, and of course, they're anti-regulatory. It all added up to a weak period for organized labor. During the 1920s, management also sought to weaken labor by pushing what it called the American Plan. And American Plan was really the key of it was what today we'd call open shop. In an open shop, the membership in a union is voluntary. In a closed shop, the employer may only hire workers who are already members of the union. And so workers in unions want closed shop. And in the 1920s, management was pushing open shop as the American plan, and they said it stressed American individualism. Americans were self-reliant. It was sort of a public relations campaign, but you can see on the billboard on the left a very pro-union billboard say, "I toil in an open shop." It is today management calls open shop the right to work. Another factor that really kind of hurt organized labor in the 1920s was the conservative Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had a number of decisions, especially early in the 1920s, that hurt labor. In 1921, for example, it upheld a lower court ruling declaring picketing illegal. That same year, it supported the injunctions against strikers. In 1922, the Justice Department quelled a strike by 400,000 railroad workers with a court injunction. In 1922 as well, the Supreme Court held that unions could be sued for damages under antitrust acts. 2 years later, in 1924, the Supreme Court refused to protect United Mine Workers from violent attacks in western Pennsylvania. The Supreme Court just wasn't a friend to organized labor. And the American Federation of Labor and its all the attendance unions, they responded by being more conservative. They sort of shied away from strikes. And it was the long-held hope that workers might have more control in the workplace sort of died. Now, it was a prosperous period, and that prosperity worked down to the workers. But as far as organized labor was concerned, it weakened organized labor. It was also not a good time for the American farmer. And in general, it was the same process that had been plaguing the American farmer since the Industrial Revolution. The farmer would go greater into debt, and to buy the tractors and the implements they needed for modern farming, they would produce more, and even though demand was going, their production would outstrip demand and prices would be lowered. There's deflation in the farm economy. That continued in the 1920s, and with all the new technology, you need less people working on the farm. And you can see in this graph the drop of farm population and farm employment. You have a government as well that is pretty anti-regulatory help for the farmer. You recall that the government, that Coolidge had vetoed the McNary-Haugen bill, which was an attempt to help farmers. There was still a vestige of progressive reformers still in Congress that pushed aid for the farmers. They became known as the Farm Bloc, and it included just people like Robert La Follette of Wisconsin and George Norris in Nebraska and you have this group that is still claiming monopoly and standing up for the farmers, but they're no longer the majority. And so the farm bloc was fighting for the farmers but didn't have much success. To try to convey their position, the farmers formed the American Farm Bureau Federation with different branches all over the country, and they would lobby Congress for help to the farmers. It, however, wasn't that successful in any of its endeavors, but it was very activist legislation. It was just not enough to counter the times. This concludes the brief section on the how unions and the farmers were still not helped by the economic boom of the 1920s.